All right, we're up. This is the Our Town with Troy By, and I am here with Jared Mitchem with the Tennessee Valley Authority.
Yeah.
I met Jared through the Committee of 100. We had kind of like a members quarterly meeting over at UAH, I believe. Yep. And here I am still, I would still call myself new to living in North Alabama. And something like the Tennessee Valley Authority, while I've heard of it, lived in the Tennessee Valley, I, for one, was very interested in the presentation you gave. And I thought to myself, man, I got to have this guy on the podcast if he'd be willing. Yeah. And, I came up and I shook your hand and told you about the podcast, gave you a card, didn't really think I'd hear back. And lo and behold, here you are.
No, yeah, it's happy to be here. It was fun.
So TVA, have you been watching Loki at all?
I have, yeah, and I saw, I think even recently, that there is an actual connection back to one of the writers.
Is there really?
Yep, one of the, and maybe it's the Marvel comic creator. I can't remember, but there is a connection to one of the writers to the Tennessee Valley Authority, not the Time Variance Authority. Yeah, so there's an actual connection in the kind of backstory to TVA.
So is that, I guess that begs the question, did they decide to, in the Loki, writing that story, if they purposely wanted to call it TVA based off the Tennessee Valley Authority,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, I guess you could speculate, yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I remember, I guess I was watching that and I was thinking, I wonder if the Tennessee Valley Authority does the same kind of merch and swag and just trying to envision what the TVA,
Ours is much more, I guess I would describe it as conservative, right? Yeah, just TVA white on TVA blue. That's about it.
Yeah. Well, just as a quick primer, you're an Alabamian.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Born and raised.
Mobile, and schooled, I say, yeah.
Birmingham, South Alabama for your undergrad,
That's
University of Alabama for law degree.
That's right. Yep, you got it.
Anything else I missed in that when you kind of explain your resume to people?
No, well, I did leave. I left the state. My first job out of college was to leave and go to ExxonMobil in Houston, Texas. Lived in Houston for a few years, which was a great place to live and be. Young, 2 incomes, no kids, right out of school. A lot of fun. Not necessarily a place I could see living long term,
really?
Raising a family.
Yeah.
Ended up back in Alabama practicing law for a little bit after that before I hired into TVA. So born and raised and schooled here and now work in North Alabama for TVA. But when I hired into TVA as a lawyer, I hired into Knoxville. And so I actually lived in Tennessee for almost 15 years.
Yeah.
12 of that in Knoxville and 3 of those in Nashville with TVA, which was a good time, I'll say. Sorry about that. To be in Tennessee as a Crimson Tide fan, right? Because I grew up in Alabama in the 70s and 80s and really couldn't help being an Alabama fan. But I lived in Knoxville and Nashville from 2015 to 2007 to 2022. So 15 years that Alabama beat UT every third Saturday in October. So I never once had to go into the office on Monday as an Alabama fan and eat crow. Yeah, for 15 years straight. It was a pretty good run. Yeah.
Now, you kind of hinted at it. You were married and both were working in Houston at the time?
Yes.
Was she your college sweetheart?
Yeah.
Your wife?
Well, my ex-wife at this
ex-wife.
point.
Okay.
Right, yep. So we were married. We got married in college. Both graduated, professional degrees, veterinarian, lawyer.
Okay.
Moved to Houston.
Gotcha.
And the rest is a whole lot of history since then. That was moved to Houston in 2000. So it's been 23 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then somewhere along the way, obviously worked for ExxonMobil. We're talking about, natural resources here, oil and gas. Is that, you did a law degree, but now you're working with the Tennessee Valley Authority. Has there always been that kind of appeal on just critical infrastructure and natural resources?
Absolutely stumbled into it. I went to law school to be a lawyer.
Really?
Because I wanted a job. Actually, my undergrad was in anthropology and archaeology. I got a chance after graduating to go do some cool work in D.C. at NIST with this archaeologist from the Smithsonian. Amazing opportunity. Lived up there for about 4 months. But I realized that I was getting to work with some of the best archaeologists in the country, from some of the best schools across the country on this cool project. And they were all making peanuts. I mean, they were passionate about the work they were doing, really focused. And I realized this was not my path, right? I thought it was fascinating and interesting, and more power to them, but really wanted a job, right? I wanted a job as a professional, and I knew some really smart lawyers. I knew some of the smartest people I knew were lawyers, and I thought, well, I can go to law school, and I can be smart and use that, right, to have a profession and a career. Enjoyed going to law school, enjoyed being a lawyer. At the end of the day, though, it was just about the law, and it was about the next case or the next issue. Wasn't really focused on my client's business, other than trying to solve whatever problem they brought us. And even came to TVA that way. When I hired into TVA, just as a lawyer. You need a lawyer, I'm a lawyer, put me to work as a lawyer. But a couple years in to working for some of our clients at TVA in economic development, right? So TVA's got 3 E's: economic development, energy, and environment. Working for some clients in economic development, they said, hey, this thing you've been working on as our lawyer, we need someone to come run that thing. Would you be interested in moving out into the business, right? Not being TVA's lawyer, but being part of the business team. So I took that chance and risk, and it was the best decision I've made professionally. OGC, the Office of the General Counsel at TVA, one of the best places you could practice law in the country. And I've worked in OGC since then, since that first gig. But getting out into the business, working with the clients, actually being a client, right, was where I really understood what TVA was about, especially in economic development, right? Getting to work on projects that transformed a community, right? So a rural community, I can remember there's one right off I-75 in Tennessee. I think it's the Charleston exit, right? I would pass that exit for years. In my early years at TVA, there was nothing off that exit. There was a gas station where you probably didn't want to stop unless you were looking for something illicit, right? You didn't want to stop there on your way back and forth from Knoxville to Chattanooga. Well, today there's a polysilicon manufacturer there, right? Now, if you're driving up that stretch of interstate at the wrong time, you can get caught in a shift change, right? And you'll see people lined up getting on and off the interstate. Hundreds of people going to work there at a plant that could have been anywhere in the country or in the world. It's in the Tennessee Valley. Transforms that community, right? And that's because TVA worked with the locals, with the state, to create an environment where it made sense for them to locate that business here. So working... And that's right. That's how all of what TVA does and all of what our partners do comes together to really change people's lives. So then I got it, right? Then I was like, oh, now I get it. I understand the point of all these 10,000 people coming to work every day. It's not to make electricity. It's not just to take care of the river. It's not just to do our jobs. It's to change the quality of people's lives, right? The quality of life in the Tennessee Valley, right? Which when we talk about the TVA mission, we talk about it in those terms. It's to improve the quality of life for people who live in this footprint that we serve.
Well, let's show the footprint real quick.
Okay.
Let me see. Let me go to that screen and that screen. So if you look at there on that top screen, that you can see it bigger. That's the footprint, right?
That's right.
And it's interesting because it takes up mostly all of Tennessee, but some of Alabama, some of Mississippi, right? Some of Kentucky. A little bit of Virginia. That's like a very small piece.
Tiny parts of Virginia and North Carolina.
Bristol and all that, and a little bit of Georgia.
Northwest Georgia, yep.
Can you, well, there's a couple things I want to touch on, but
sure.
Let's talk about, and this is a question where, I grew up in the Mid-Atlantic in Virginia, and as we grew up, most of our, other than stuff we did with U.S. history, when it came to regional stuff they teach you, it was all about Jamestown and the Commonwealth of Virginia, and one of the first states and all this kind of stuff. I didn't get a lot of Southern history. In fact, I tried to call John Kovach because I know he's a professor of antebellum and public history, and even though he's from Maryland, right? He taught down here. And you were kind of just keying on this as far as how life-changing electricity is. And now I even interviewed a company that did Ace Fiber, just brought like internet to Corinth, Mississippi. Right. So now we're starting to see in our term in these days, even in these present days, not everybody has internet.
That's right.
And when they do, it transforms the community. Right. They've always had electricity, but now we're not. Yeah, we all have electricity. We take it for granted. But do you have internet? Mm-hmm. And then what does that do for your community? Can you talk a little bit, to the extent that you know, about just the South? And then let's talk about, as we do that, kind of talk about the origins of the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. So we're looking at the footprint. You were talking about sites being chosen. What was the one you just mentioned in Tennessee? Clark?
I think it was Charleston.
Near
Charleston.
But the Muscle Shoals was one that was chosen. Like there's all these strategic
early
things.
On, yeah.
But can you first, I guess, just give a little bit of the Southern history, the lack of electricity?
Yeah.
Because I think there was only like 2% of all the South or the TVA that had electricity, like in the 1930s. Yeah. Can you touch on that?
Yeah, sure. So the neat thing about the map,
I'll bring it back.
There's two kind of different shaded areas there. One is the river system, right?
Yeah.
The watershed, as we call it, right? So, and I'll start there because improving the quality of life for people in this region didn't start with electricity, right? It started with the Tennessee River, right?
Okay.
This idea that you had this resource in an area of the country where people were very poor, where there was seasonal flooding that limited growth, right? Economic and industrial growth in places like Chattanooga. People were poor. I think I may have said that already. Agricultural practices essentially consisted of clear cutting and hope, right? So the deforestation from the clear cutting, the seasonal rains, and the flooding created all sorts of erosion. The river needed to be tamed, right? We needed some integrated resource plan for taming the river, reforesting large parts of the Tennessee Valley that had been clear cut, and improving agricultural practices, right? So you mentioned Muscle Shoals. You mentioned Wilson Dam, right?
Yeah.
Is where it all started, right? So the United States had already built Wilson Dam, or was building Wilson Dam to support the World War I effort. The dam had a couple of associated nitrate plants because you could use the nitrates to make munitions for World War I. Well, the dam wasn't completed before the war was over. So by the time the dam's completed, you've got a dam on the river that's going to improve, flooding and navigation right there in the shoals, generate some electricity to run these nitrate plants, but you don't need it for munitions anymore. Henry Ford apparently was interested in purchasing Wilson Dam for pennies on the dollar, right?
Oh, really?
What it cost I think, and I'll probably get these numbers wrong, U.S. government has spent $150 million building Wilson Dam. He wanted it for about $5 million to build a Detroit of the South around this asset. Deal didn't go through, and instead, that became the first TVA asset. So Wilson Dam predated TVA, but when TVA was created, the headquarters were in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and Wilson Dam was its first and only asset, right? But that was kind of the anchor for this vision of an integrated resource plan. We've got this valuable resource. We can tame this river and manage it for flood control. We can manage it for navigation, improve the navigability of the river, manage it for recreation, right? Manage it for environmental stewardship, right? And the generation of electricity. So when power was initially generated at Wilson Dam and TVA wanted to sell the excess, right, beyond running the nitrate plants, which were then repurposed to make fertilizer, right, as part of this agricultural revolution that was going on all over the world, TVA wanted to sell the excess power from Wilson Dam, and the neighboring utilities, the utilities surrounded TVA, said no, right? We don't need the government in the electricity business. That case went actually all the way to the Supreme Court, arguing about whether TVA could sell what was effectively surplus government property. We've got excess electricity. The electricity is government property. We should be able to surplus it just like we surplus any other government property. TVA won that case. That created a foundation, a legal foundation for then TVA to sell power to others, right? And I think in the early 1930s, Tupelo, Mississippi was the first town to receive TVA power and power its city. You're absolutely right, though, that most of the valley did not have electricity at the time. Around the same time TVA was created, the rural electrification effort started nationwide, right? So, and you saw the creation of a bunch of rural electric cooperatives. We've got 8 of those in North Alabama today. Joe Wheeler, EMC to the west of here, Sand Mountain Electric Cooperative to the east, and several others. Those types of rural electric cooperatives were created, member-owned cooperatives were created around that same time as well, because there was no money to be made electrifying rural America, right? There was electricity in the urban centers, kind of like the internet and fiber situation you described today or in recent years, right? There's money to be made where customers are dense and you can make an investment and recover your investment. There's less money to be made where the customers are spread out, right? And there's only one every mile or so. So TVA was created along with this rural electrification effort to then, right, it had the ability to then electrify the valley with what initially was just hydropower, right? So you had Wilson Dam, and then you start on a project of building other dams all along the 600-plus mile Tennessee River. The first one TVA built was in Norris, Tennessee, but Wheeler and Gunnersville Dam followed pretty quickly here in the 1930s as well. And that was the first kind of backbone along the river, right? Because that's what the whole enterprise was built around. Build it around this river, tame it, manage it for recreation, navigation, commerce, and power generation. But pretty quickly, as the valley electrified and the economy started to grow here, there was a demand for a lot more than just what you could produce from those hydro assets, right?
Let's do this. Let's watch 1 minute of your Wilson Dam video.
Oh, yeah.
And then we'll go from there. I think it's like 5 minutes, but I want to at least showcase the things that you all likely demo or present, right, to people when you're educating them.
Yep.
Welcome to the Wilson Dam, located on the Tennessee River between Florence and Muscle Shoals in North Alabama. Wilson has quite a history and is one of the more distinctive dams in the TVA system. It is the only TVA facility listed as a National Historic Landmark. It predates TVA. In fact, the decision to build this facility goes back over 100 years to America's entry into World War I. The National Defense Act of 1916 authorized immediate construction for 2 nitrate plants to be powered by an adjacent hydroelectric facility. Government engineers selected Muscle Shoals, Alabama, as the construction site. Surveys noted that it had the most potential for the development of water power east of the Rocky Mountains. Under direction of the Secretary of War, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers started construction on Wilson in 1918. The dam was closed in 1924, at which time only 40% of its electric generating capacity was installed. With the signing of the TVA Act in May 1933, TVA assumed ownership of all of the government facilities at Muscle Shoals, including Wilson. As we admire the exterior of this great dam, note the many spillway gates. Originally, the dam's face bore 58 spillway gates. There are now 49 due to the installation of a new lock in 1959. Each gate is capable of discharging 10,000 cubic feet of water per second. Wilson is a multi-purpose dam, meaning that besides generating electricity, it has other uses, such as providing flood control and navigation. Notice a small, older lock, which was built as part of the original project. In 1959, TVA opened a larger, single-lift...
Okay, maybe 2 minutes.
Yeah.
But I think that gives a good summary of everything you just said.
No, actually, yeah, you could have just played the whole 5
No,
minutes
it's okay.
instead of listening to me. That would be
No.
perfect. And it'll probably correct some of the things I got wrong. But yeah, it all started there. It is TVA's first and largest dam. And when I say largest, it's largest by far, right?
Yeah.
We talk in terms of megawatts, in terms of generation, 660 megawatts, right? That's that's half a gas plant. And in hydroelectric terms, it is much larger than any other dam on the TVA system. It's 3/4 of a mile across the river there. I mean, it really is an impressive and really valuable structure that will have been doing all that work, right? The flood control, the navigation, the power generation for 100 years next year, which
Wow.
just blows me away.
Do you guys have plans on?
We are working on them. Yep,
commemorating that?
to appropriately celebrate that. Yeah,
That's cool.
because that's I don't know. I think about infrastructure sometimes and the things that to your point earlier about electricity. At this point, we take for granted.
Yeah.
Right. The roads and the water and the electricity that just works, and those are big investments and those are big projects, and sometimes those impact people right now. Right. Like, well, where are you going to put this new big thing that you need to build? But wow, to imagine that you could build an asset like that.
Yeah.
And 100 years later, I mean, there were people who poured concrete on that dam. There were people who designed that dam. There were people who, right, 100 years later,
Yeah.
it's still there performing, just creating value for every one of us every day.
Isn't that amazing?
That's really cool to think that, and that is one of the things I like now that I had, like we were talking before, I stumbled into working in energy. I came to TVA just as a lawyer, but for 16 years now, I've been lucky that they kept me around, and I've got to work on and understand this industry. And it really gives me an appreciation for being part of something 90 years old at TVA, right? But 100 years old at Wilson Dam, right? These kind of generational projects that you can work on and be part of and do your little part to support that literally long after you're dead could still be providing benefits to your children and their grandchildren. It's neat.
Now TVA, you belong to the Department of Energy?
No, we don't. We are
don't.
an independent.
You are, okay.
Independent federal agency, executive branch agency, but we're a corporation, right? So we are a federal corporation and a federal agency with our own TVA Act, created TVA in 1933, our own statute that creates us, establishes a governance structure. We got a board of directors,
Interesting.
right? And the board, we today have a 9-member board, 9-member part-time board. They are nominated or appointed by the president, but have to be confirmed by the Senate. They serve 5-year terms. They're kind of staggered, right? So that some are rolling off every year and some are getting nominated and hopefully confirmed to roll on. 9-member board. And beneath that, since 2006, prior to 2006, it was a three-member full-time board, right? They ran the company.
Okay.
But since then, it's this modern corporate structure, nine presidentially appointed directors, and beneath that, it's a traditional corporate structure. We've got a CEO, a C-suite of a chief operating officer, CFO, all the rest, and the rest of the company looks more like, in organizational terms, like any other large 10,000 person, $12 billion company would look. Now, the things we do are different, right? Because we're not for profit.
Yeah.
It is our rates, which are our source of revenue. We don't get any federal appropriations anymore. TVA did in the early days, but does not receive federal appropriations. We're completely self-funded through the sale of power. And those rates fund not just the electric system and the investments we make there, but they fund these other things TVA was created to do, right? Take care of the river. Don't just dam and extract value from the river, but take care of the river and manage it as a really valuable resource. And the lands adjoining the river, right? A resource for, again, generations. And the economic development mission. All those things we do in economic development and environmental stewardship today are funded out of the electric side of the business. But again, not for profit. At the end of the day, the rates reflect exactly what it costs to carry out the mission.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So in the early days, This is interesting. In my industry, I'm very familiar with like a federally funded research and development company, like a MITRE. But then yet, and this whole doing research on this has been hurting my head because it's really like it's not like anything I've ever come across. Right. No familiarity with something like the TVA, before now, and or what's similar to it, right? Where you're trying to draw parallels. So in the beginning, you said you don't receive any. And at the beginning, there were some federal appropriations.
Absolutely, yeah.
Was there a timetable where they felt like you would have needed federal appropriations for some period of time, but then yet you ended up selling a lot more electricity than they would have previously thought? So you kind of like, no, we're good. After like, let's say 5 years, hey, we don't need to appropriate federal funds anymore for the TVA. This looks like they're doing gangbusters and doing fine on their own.
Well, it went on a lot longer than 5 years.
Okay.
And I'll misremember the dates. So consult Wikipedia or other reputable sources. But looking back, TVA grew and expanded as it, like I said, the dams originally provided a certain amount of excess power to sell, right? And as the economy in the region grew, the demand outstripped that supply, right? So then TVA started to build coal plants, right? To provide more electricity. And TVA continued to grow. TVA continued to grow its service territory. The other shaded part of that map you had up earlier that's larger than just the watershed grew beyond the watershed.
Okay.
And it continued to grow. And so TVA built coal plants. TVA ultimately embarked on its nuclear path and nuclear construction projects. But as TVA was growing, the incumbent or neighboring utilities never liked the idea to begin with, right? You had that original litigation over TVA's ability to even sell power. And my guess, I don't know, I haven't read the history, is that there's this process of going to Washington, D.C. to get appropriations to build the next coal plant. That seems like a very political process and seems like maybe it would be easier. Someone must have said, if we could self-fund these projects, if we could issue our own bonds and fund these projects with debt just like any other company would. I need to build a big capital asset. Well, I'm going to go to the market and get some debt to fund this big project. We'd love to be able to do that at TVA ourselves. Well, here's the trade-off. You're going to need legislation to be able to do that. You want legislation to be able to do that? That's fine. You can be self-funding. You can service the debt of those bonds with your electric sales. That all sounds great. Here's the trade-off. You can't grow anymore. You can't get any bigger. That's the bargain we're going to strike. We'll take the reins off. You can self-fund. You can run your own business, but you won't have to come to Congress for appropriations anymore, but you're contained by what we call today the fence. Whatever you're serving in the Tennessee Valley today is all you will ever serve. So they basically drew a statutory fence around TVA that said, as of this date in history, you can issue bonds, you can self-fund your business, but you can't get any bigger. So that's the green area on the map, and that's been the case since 1957, if I'm remembering my dates correctly. Yep.
So you had mentioned there's some coal-fired plants. It looks like mostly in Tennessee. There's the nuclear plants along the river. It's a pretty cool map here.
Yeah.
So is there anything like the TVA in other parts of the country where they're a independent?
So the closest would be the Bonneville Power Authority out in the Northwest, right? But they are different in important ways from TVA, right? There really is only one TVA, which, maybe as a TVA homer, because I've worked there for 16 years, right? but even the model makes a lot of sense to me. This idea that you've got a regional asset, first of all, that crosses state lines, right? We've got 30% of the Tennessee River in North Alabama, but that's not all of it, right? So you got this regional project that crosses an asset that crosses state line. You've got what is this critically important, essential service that you provide in terms of electricity, right? So you're managing this regional asset, you're providing this essential service to people that really makes the 21st century run, right? The idea that you would be, federally owned,
Yeah.
but locally and regionally kind of operated and managed in a nonprofit way, right? So that makes all the sense in the world to me for this kind of enterprise and effort. And so I'm always surprised that TVA is the only TVA, that it wasn't a model that was replicated other places. But then again, it may be unique because the Tennessee River is unique, right?
Yeah.
That 652-mile river, where it is in the country, the challenges it presented, but also then the opportunities if you get it right. And I feel like TVA, the visionaries who kind of conceived this, and President Roosevelt, who signed the TVA Act into law, I feel like their vision for that has been realized, right? And maybe it was just a unicorn, a once in a long time opportunity.
I was flashing back. I was thinking about my episode with the zoo. Ethan Woodruff is a fellow that's trying to help bring the zoo to North Alabama. If you look at I-565, they have one in Nashville. You come down, you kind of skip over our area. Then you have one in Birmingham, Montgomery, down to Mobile. And in that, we have like the most species of fish in our waters east of the Mississippi, type thing. Yeah. And that's just like one stat, And then when I was talking to the Mazda Toyota people, there's these two fish that are endemic to the waters of Limestone County, meaning that's the only place they live.
Yep.
Right. And I just think of like more and more how special North Alabama is.
Oh, absolutely.
And then I just an interview with like, oh, okay, we'll talk about the Wilson Dam and whatever else, but in Muscle Shoals, they picked Muscle Shoals, North Alabama, as the starting point for all of this.
Yeah.
And you look at this map, and we don't, as far as the TVA goes, North Alabama is not a huge percentage, on the footprint of it, but vitally important.
Yeah, well, I'll give you some numbers there. So yeah, you look at this map, and it's 10% of the footprint by acreage or square mileage, right? But it's 20%. Well, it's 30% of the river, first of all, right? By mileage, right? There's about 200 miles of that 652-mile river flow through North Alabama, which really is what makes North Alabama different from things further south, right? The Tennessee River and the River Valley really defines it, I think. So 30% of the river, about 20% of TVA employees live and work in North Alabama. Now, most of those are at Browns Ferry. They're at the big nuclear plant. So we talked about Wilson Dam, first and largest hydro. Browns Ferry is the first and largest nuclear plant in
That's
TVA's
Browns Ferry
fleet.
right there, right?
Yep. And Browns Ferry will be 50 next year, right? So again, another major infrastructure investment. Browns Ferry, Wilson Dam, Wheeler, Gunnersville.
Is that which one's this?
That's a gas asset. I'm not sure which one that is. I can't recognize them all that well.
We'll come back to it.
But between those dams, between Browns Ferry, I think you just showed the new Colbert combustion turbines, natural gas, solar that we've got in North Alabama, some other gas plants that we contract for in Morgan County. You got 20% of TVA's generation sitting in North Alabama. So 10% of the footprint, 30% of the river, 20% of the generation that supports the whole 7-state region, 20% of the employees, and about 15% of TVA revenue is generated from sales in North Alabama. So you put all that together,
pulling our weight.
Yeah, we're punching above our weight, I think, in North Alabama, which is great. I mean, that means that North Alabama is really blessed with a lot of natural resources, a lot of huge infrastructure investments, right, that power the region and put people to work here. And then with the kind of the economic activity that spawns and generates, right? So yeah, we're small, but there's a lot packed in here. One other maybe example that makes the point: TVA as a federal corporation agency does not pay taxes to. We don't pay taxes. Right. So the state of Alabama, for example, or Madison County doesn't get to charge TVA taxes.
Right.
If TVA has assets in the state or in the county or makes a purchase in the state or the county that you would otherwise collect taxes on, TVA gets a pass. What TVA does instead is TVA makes what we call payments in lieu of taxes. Some people call it pilot for short. So instead of paying taxes, we take 5% of our revenue annually, which is about $12 billion these days. We take 5% of our revenue that we collect and put it in this payment in lieu of taxes category. That is distributed to the states where we do business based on two things: sales and assets. So it's a formula that says, more sales and more assets means you get more pro rata share of the payments in lieu of taxes, which is a long prelude to the point I wanted to make, which is you look at that map and you look at Alabama and you look at maybe Mississippi and you look maybe at Kentucky and think, well, why, what's so special about North Alabama? You got to add Kentucky and Mississippi's payments in lieu of taxes together to get to the $90 million or so a year that Alabama pays to the state of Alabama. So just in terms of density, right, of activity, assets, what we've got in that 10% of North Alabama adds up to everything we've got in Mississippi and Kentucky. Yeah.
So is some of the, let's call it the genius of the pilot system, is some of that protecting in a way essentially what TVA is all about, in the sense of, okay, if you were to pay taxes, that tax revenue, once received by the state or whoever, may not have that benefit and trickle back out into the economy the way, versus, hey, we're gonna take charge of this and these payments in lieu of,
right,
and more higher proportionally, benefit these beneficiaries. Does that make sense?
That does. I don't know if that's the answer or the rationale. I just know that as a federal agency, you don't have to pay taxes.
Right.
As a lawyer, I would guess it's probably a supremacy clause issue, right? State doesn't get to tax the federal government. And so I imagine that's the case for other federal entities and agencies doing business in states, right? Where, again, you federal tax exempt, but in lieu of paying taxes, you make these other payments to the state. Because I do think it's important to make sure that, right, again, TVA is built, it's really neat in so many ways, right? It's built for the people here, right? It says that on our assets, right? You go to the dam and etched in one of those historic structures is built for the people, right? This is, we don't have any shareholders, right? There's no one we need to answer to for quarterly profits or for dividends or growth, right? We don't have an imperative to do anything other than serve the people who live in this footprint, right? The 10 million and growing people who live in this 7-state region. So I think kind of this pilot approach where we take this percentage of revenue, I guess we don't otherwise have to pay taxes, but we take this percentage of revenue and allocate it to those states to say, hey, we're in your communities. We've got assets in your community. There are lots of benefits, but certainly there are trade-offs, right? Here's money, and then we send it to Montgomery in the case of Alabama, and then Montgomery has a formula. The state of Alabama has a method for allocating that back out. I think over 80% of it comes back to North Alabama, the counties where TVA serves, and then about the balance of it goes to the general fund.
Make sure you get behind the mic a
sorry.
little bit.
Yep.
That's fine. Is there still people active lobbying against the concept of TVA, and or they should be paying taxes and we need to change the structure?
Somewhere, yes, right. Somewhere someone is complaining about some aspect of TVA, right? We're a big company and we don't just do one thing. We do a lot of things that impact a lot of people's lives. And of course, that's the power of TVA. If we do a good job, we can impact people's lives in a really positive way. But because it's so complex and because it's so consequential, there are trade-offs, right? There are trade-offs in all these decisions and approaches. And so, the idea that you can satisfy everyone on every issue will never be the case. So there's always a critic. But I think the proof is in the results, right? Low rates, which is affordability, right? I mean, this is an essential service that everyone has to have, needs to be affordable. Well, it's not just affordable for the people who live here; it's also really competitive for people who are looking to locate or grow their businesses in this part of the country, which is really good for the people who live here, right? Because that creates jobs, that creates economic development and growth that helps everyone. So, again, as you're building big assets, as you're making kind of decisions with tough trade-offs, yeah, you got to be able to have those conversations with the folks who feel like, well, maybe you should have struck the balance a little differently.
Yeah.
No, back in, I can't remember what year now, it was an Obama administration suggestion in their budget, maybe it was 2011, was the last time the Obama administration's budget suggested studying the idea of selling part of TVA, of selling the transmission assets of TVA. That the idea that we should study selling part of TVA generated a real groundswell of support for TVA. And again, not from anyone in D.C. or New York or right? It was from people who live in this part of the country who are served by TVA, who understand the value proposition of having a company and a partner and a federal agency that is, I mean, mission bound to serve them, right? I mean, it's federal law. It's not like a corporate charter that we could change tomorrow and just decide, well, you know what, we're going to pivot, as they say, right, and do something different and chase some other objective or goal. Literally, the TVA Act is federal law, and it says, this is why this company was created. Here are the kinds of things that are important. Here are the kinds of factors you should consider.
Yeah.
This is how you should run the company, and this is who you should run the company for. That's pretty powerful, especially when someone suggests, well, maybe we should try something else.
Yeah. So what was the nature? Take us back to the part of your career when you were, litigating or part of litigation. Give me a nature of kind of the common lawsuit, and what were you defending the TVA on?
Oh man, it ran the gamut. Again, because it's such a big company, and of course I was one lawyer in an office of about 45 lawyers.
Okay.
TVA has in-house. TVA does a lot of its own legal work in-house with some of the best lawyers in the country from all over the country. But as a big company that does a lot of different things, it could be anything from a dispute with a supplier, right, on some critical component that we needed for a plant, right? It's just a commercial dispute with a supplier to
contract terms, if you will, and
exactly.
Okay.
Contract lawsuits and disputes. That's where I worked, commercial litigation. But the group internally at TVA has a bunch of environmental lawyers, right? So lawyers who want to make sure that we get environmental compliance right as we're running our business, and then defending TVA in the case where someone says you didn't get it right? So. So environmental cases, a lot of real estate work, right? We're always building something, right? And a lot of times that might be a transmission line. Well, we need to get a transmission line from here to there. We need to negotiate with people whose property we want to cross over. In some cases, maybe have to condemn rights to that path. A lot of lawyers working on real estate type issues,
eminent domain and stuff like that.
Yep. And then a lot of lawyers just making sure that we're running our utility, and these would be the same at lots of other utilities, right? Running our utility consistent with regulatory requirements, which run the gamut, again, from environmental to reliability oversight from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So
Got it.
yeah.
But so now you're on a different side of it. You're more in the operations and business side.
So I got to work in economic development for a while, which again is where I got it. I realized, okay, I'm not just a lawyer showing up every day to figure out what the problem to solve is. I understood the company and I felt invested in the company because I saw the impact it could have, right?
Yeah.
The kind of life-changing impact it could have in a really positive way. So I worked in economic development for a few years. That's when I was in Nashville. came back to Knoxville and worked in pricing and contracts. And so pricing and contracts was all about putting contracts, rates, and those types of things in place, pricing in place with our customers and the people we sell power to. So I don't know if I mentioned this before, but TVA only has about 215 customers. $12 billion of power, 215 customers. 156 of those are local power companies. 54. 56 when I got here, 54 now, mergers and other things. 154 of those are local power companies, like Huntsville Utilities, right? Or like Athens Utilities, or like Joe Wheeler Co-op to the west of here, right? We sell to them basically at wholesale, and then they turn around and sell power to you and me at home, right? And we write our check to them, so they're the retail provider. In addition to them, we've got about 70 customers, 60 to 70 customers. It fluctuates, that TVA sells power to directly without a local power company in between us, and we call those directly served customers. Redstone Arsenal is an example of that.
Sure.
So large federal customers, we have a direct relationship with them. We got a really unique, really strong relationship with Redstone. And then there are some other really large, unique power users, like a really large steel mill, like a really large data center, a chemical company, lots of really power-intensive operations. A lot of these companies have been here, maybe not the data centers, but for decades, right? They kind of came with TVA in the early days because they saw access to the river and other infrastructure and low-cost, reliable power, and they built big power-intensive operations here. Again, chemical companies, paper, pulping, primary metals, steel, aluminum, those kind of things.
24/7.
So those kinds of operations, TVA will sometimes sell to directly if, and this is based on our contract with those local power companies, if it makes sense for TVA to serve them directly, basically.
Yeah.
So I got to work in a group that negotiated and put together and managed those contracts, the power supply contracts for getting power to all of these customers. So again, then I was learning, again, it was a very different perspective on the business, but kind of the nuts and bolts of, hey, this is where $12 billion of revenue comes from. This is what we're delivering and who we're delivering it to. Then I went back to the law department for about 5 years before my current role, which was, like I said, great place to practice law, amazing lawyers, really high caliber work on really neat issues that make it all the way to the Supreme Court. In a leadership role before I took this job. This job is regional vice president. So this job didn't exist 5 years ago. It was a move by TVA to try to get closer to our stakeholders, to the people the company was built for, right? And understand local and regional objectives and priorities in a way that might be a little harder from corporate headquarters, which is now in Knoxville, Tennessee. Might be hard to really understand North Alabama in the same way from Knoxville, right? Makes sense. And so TVA created, for purposes of customer relations, community relations, government relations at the kind of state, local level, we created 4 regions: North, South, East, and West. North Alabama is TVA's South region.
Okay.
And so my role is to be TVA's regional vice president in the South region, live and work here in Huntsville and Madison, take care of our customers. I mentioned the 8 co-ops earlier. We got 17 of the municipally owned electric departments like Huntsville Utilities or Cortland, Alabama. Take care of them, take care of our state and local officials here, county commissioners, mayors, folks in the House and Senate in Montgomery, right, who are very interested in TVA's plans and how we're executing those plans and how it's impacting their constituents. And then our other community relationships, right, whether that's with the Space and Rocket Center or any number of nonprofits or our educational partners at Drake State or UNA or UAH or, right, taking care of those stakeholders, making sure, like I said, I think, always tell people our job is not to carry the water for TVA. right? I mean, at some point, I'm going to tell you what's important to TVA and why I think it's the right thing, right? If we're investing in an asset or making a business decision. But the first part of our job is to listen, right? 51% of that job, at least, is making sure we understand what matters to people in North Alabama. What are the objectives and priorities of the people we serve, right, in North Alabama? Then make sure that makes it back into the TVA business decision-making machine, right? Make sure that's an input that's accounted for so we can best serve folks here. Then I'll come back and tell you, hey, here's the thing we're doing and here's why it's a great idea, right? Because it's factored in what's important to folks here in North Alabama.
So walk me through some of the, I guess the major thrusts, right, from consumers are going to be, I want it to be reliable, whatever my energy needs are, they're reliable. Hopefully it's at a good cost or keep costs down, which I'm sure there's a lot of pressure on anybody and everything, right, with the high inflation and rising costs of everything, right? That's I'm sure that's a constant. Are we doing enough to and educating people on, hey, these are the rates we're at right now, right? It's just kind of the, economic reality. What are some of the other? And then I guess the other is just demand for new services. But what am I missing in that, or can you go into any more detail of the things I mentioned?
I mean, you hit it right off the head: affordability and reliability, right? Okay. We take it for granted, and we want to be able to take it for granted. Right? We don't want that disrupted, right? So, the idea that it's reliable, that 24/7, 365, we've got electricity to power all the things that make our lives in the 21st century kind of work, right? And to your point, that it's affordable because it's an essential service, because I can't afford to do without it.
Right.
It's got to be affordable. And TVA, I mentioned the TVA Act earlier, the fact that it's federal law, right? The TVA board sets TVA's rates, right? The rates we charge Huntsville Utilities and our other customers. The TVA Act says those rates have to be as low as feasible, right? Doesn't say you can charge whatever you want. It says they've got to be as low as feasible. And when we go to make investment decisions as we bring new assets online, well, there's another statute that says you've got to use least cost planning. Means you've got to plan your system to deliver reliable electricity in a least cost manner. So you've got this driver on the side where you're spending the money that says spend it in a least cost way, and a driver on the side where you're collecting the money that says the rates have to be as low as feasible. It is an imperative at TVA that the rates are affordable for folks like you and me, right? To have to factor that into our budgets. And then when it comes to folks who can make a decision about where to put the next manufacturing plant, right? They've got to be not just affordable, but competitive, right? Because you're competing for those investments with other parts of the country. But you're right, it's reliability and it's affordability. Now, it's changing. People want other things. They want to know, well, where did it come from? Some consumers want to know, everybody wants affordable and reliable. Some consumers want to know, well, what's the carbon content of this? Is this renewable power I'm getting? Is it nuclear power? Is it where in your fleet is it coming from? Right. So I can feel good about my carbon footprint. Right. And some of those are personal decisions. Some of those are business decisions. Right. But we're listening and hearing that for sure. And have been responding for a good decade now to demands from consumers for lower carbon electricity, and our portfolio has been trending that direction. So that more information, right? Some consumers, there's so many services you buy right now. You just open your phone and swipe and see all kinds of information about what how you've consumed or used that product. We're making those investments too, and our local power companies are making those investments too, to give people more access to information. But I think in addition to reliability and affordability, the next one is what we would put under the bigger category of sustainability, right? What is that carbon footprint? What are the environmental or other community impacts, right, of how you're generating and getting this power to me? And as a consumer, do I feel good about that? Does that align with what I think is important, right? Whether it's climate change or some other issue, right? Is this product I'm purchasing from you consistent with my objectives and my priorities, right? So we got to listen and understand what those are.
So as compared to like the rest of the country, I would assume since those mandates are in place federally,
Yep.
then in other parts of the country, I'm sure people are paying much higher rates because the provider is perhaps inflating their rates because they can.
Yeah, the rates are low in the Tennessee Valley, absolutely, right? Like top quartile residential rates, right at top quartile residential rates, some of the lowest industrial rates in the region and the country. So the rates are lower on average here. Find a lot of this data at TVA.gov. Than the rest of the country, and in some cases dramatically lower, right?
Yeah.
The last, and this varies, right? Because again, TVA is the wholesaler. You've got local power companies. Most of their cost of doing business is what they pay to TVA, right? For the power they buy from us.
Right.
But they've got other costs. They've got staff. They've got infrastructure,
Sure.
the distribution lines to get the power to your house, trucks. They've got
Right.
their business to run. And so it depends, kind of, it can vary a little, but at the wholesale level, TVA had a 4-year stretch, the 4 years prior, where we held our base wholesale rates flat, right? They stayed flat for 4 years. And in that 4-year period, we absorbed a lot of the inflationary and interest rate and wage pressures that were building. We just recently, this last August, raised rates again for the first time in, I guess, 5 years, 4.5% at the wholesale level. But if you look at inflation and you look at those things I just talked about, 4.5% is pretty reasonable.
Yeah.
But that's all, again, as low as feasible. That we're making difficult, prudent business decisions every day to deliver on that.
Sure. Yeah. Let's talk about solar.
Yeah.
What's going on with TVA related to solar in North Alabama in the South region?
Yeah, so we're building and buying solar because it's an affordable resource that we can diversify our portfolio with. TVA is really blessed. One of the reasons the rates are low here is because we've got this diversified portfolio. We've got coal plants, natural gas, hydroelectric, nuclear, and now increasingly solar, right? And those all perform differently and provide different benefits to the system. And they have different attributes, right? That you can optimize in different ways depending on what the demand is, depending on what the weather is, right? Mm-hmm. Solar's an important part of that. Now, because once you've built it, once you've made that capital, there is no fuel cost, right? Our gas plants perform really well. They do certain things really well. We've obviously got to have a gas pipeline, right? And when we run a gas plant, we're buying fuel. We're buying natural gas that our customers are paying for. Same thing with a coal plant. Now, the fuel on the river is free. That's really nice as long as we're getting a lot of rain. Nuclear plant does require fuel as well, but we refuel one of those units about every 18 months, and the fuel cost is a really, really small part of running a nuclear plant. Solar, there is no fuel cost, right? It's like the river system. It's just once you've built it, when the sun's shining, it generates electricity. So we are adding solar to the entire TVA portfolio because the cost has come down. It's price competitive. Mm-hmm. And it further diversifies our portfolio, right? It gives us one more resource that we can rely on as conditions evolve and change. And it's zero carbon, right, on the generation side. So what we're doing in North Alabama is we've got already have TVA's first and largest, TVA's largest utility scale solar in Colbert County, Alabama, near the Shoals. We commissioned that and brought it online in 2021. I say we did. I've got to give one more preamble before I talk about what we're up to with these projects. TVA, historically, as we've added solar to the system, we do that through arrangements with third-party solar developers. So TVA is not building a solar farm. TVA is contracting with a developer who builds a solar farm, and then sells us the power under a 20-year PPA. All the power of that solar farm and a PPA is a power purchase agreement, right? So
Okay.
they build it. We agree to buy all the power for 20 years. Of course, that gets them their payback on and return on investment. But we've not been in the business of building solar like we've been building and operating the other plants in our fleet. The solar developers kind of got a head start. They can take advantage. They have been able to take advantage of tax credits that TVA is not able to take advantage of. So they can build and operate and deliver the power to TVA at a cost lower than TVA could go build the same solar plant. So what we'll do typically, we'll go to the market and say, we want 1,000 megawatts of solar power. People will submit responses to our request for proposal, certain prices, certain locations. They say, I can get you 100 megawatts here at this price. I can get you 200 megawatts there at that price. We'll review those proposals and decide which ones to strike on. Right?
Interesting.
So we issued a 5,000 megawatt clean energy RFP last year, got a lot of response from that. And in response to that, we've identified some where the developers brought us projects in Northwest Alabama. So there's currently one in Lawrence County. There's one in Colbert County. These are big projects in the sense of acreage. Mm-hmm. That's the thing about solar. It's not energy dense. You need a lot of solar panels to generate electricity. And so these are 1,000 or 2,000 acre projects, right? You could put a gas plant on much smaller footprint, for example, right? So we've got two of those projects that we're considering in Lawrence and Colbert County. And that's exactly what we already have on the system near the Shoals at a plant we call Muscle Shoals Solar. I refer to it as ours all the time. It's actually Ørsted, big renewable energy company, replied to one of our earlier RFPs. We contracted with them. They built it. We signed a 20-year contract. It sits there and generates electricity for the next 20 years. Got two more of those on the table, like I said, in Lawrence and Colbert County that we're evaluating. And then the one that's most exciting also happens to be in Lawrence County, project about the same size. This is going to be the first TVA owned and built solar. Right. There were some changes to the law, including the Inflation Reduction Act recently, that kind of leveled the playing field with us and the developers. Now, they've still got a head start on building these things. They've been doing it for 10 years or more at this point. So they can still deliver them really at a cost competitive price. But we think maybe we can now too. And so we've got a site in Lawrence County where TVA intends to build about the same, couple thousand acres of solar. And we're already building the infrastructure, the transmission infrastructure to connect it to the grid. And we've got panels in a warehouse, right? We're ready to go on that project.
Interesting.
Yeah. So more solar on the horizon. It's really west of I-65 where it seems like the good sites are, because that's where the developers have gone out and brought us proposals. And that's true really for the whole west half of the TVA system. It's really Northwest Alabama, West Tennessee, Mississippi. You get back east of I-65, the terrain changes, right? And it's not as
Well, I imagine that's also city councils and county commissions have got to get together and decide if they want to zone land for that kind of use, right?
Yeah. And that land use conversation is an important one, right? These are developers are bringing projects where it's easy for them to build a project, right?
Yeah,
and that's typically open farmland, right? It's not, you don't want to have to go clear cut forest to build solar. You're looking typically at agricultural land. We try to look for more marginal land, right, to put those on. But the developers are bringing those projects on agricultural land, and the local communities have a conversation about land use, right?
Yeah.
And those are hard conversations because it might change, right? But what that part, that those couple thousand acres certainly feel and look like in a community that's been agricultural and rural for a long time. The flip side of that is you got someone with property that they own, who's evaluating the financial opportunity maybe for their family long term. These are 20-year contracts, right? And so the decision whether to continue to farm this land or to lease this land for farming or some other purpose or for solar development, you get right to this kind of property rights issue, right? And that's, again, when I was saying earlier, TVA does consequential things, and so has to make hard business decisions with trade-offs, right? This is a perfect example, right? So on the one hand, you've got a rural community, and some members of that community would like for it to maintain a certain feel, and then you've got other members of the community who are looking for an opportunity to use their land in a different way. And that's a local conversation that we absolutely respect. And when I said earlier, our job is to listen and understand what are the priorities and objectives. Absolutely. We got to hear that. We have a public process before we do anything as a federal agency. Any major federal action requires an environmental review, but environmental review is so much more than endangered species. It's the better way to describe it is kind of a holistic view of community impacts. So we're looking at obviously wildlife and the flora and fauna, right? But we're also looking at traffic. We're also looking at these impacts to historical resources and community impacts. So we have a public process actually where the folks in these communities where TVA is going to build infrastructure get an opportunity to provide comment and input. And which is a really important part because, again, like I said, you're going to go build something that provides hopefully a lot of benefit and maybe for generations. You still want to do that in a thoughtful way. You don't want to wreck a community with the wrong project, right? You want to build something in a thoughtful way that carefully balances those competing maybe objectives and interests. So
yeah. Well, and there's a lot that compete for that. I think about the Singing River Trail. That's going to span 200 plus miles across North Alabama, right? And whether or not somebody wants that traversing their land or and its use, which was they have, I guess, Launch 2035 has a land use committee. And thinking back to those episodes where that kind of ties to some of the things that have come out of that.